My own daughter told me to shut up on New Year's Eve, right there in front of everyone at her fancy party in downtown Atlanta, with champagne glasses clinking and fireworks ready to light up the sky. I was just trying to share a story about Vietnam, about how we celebrated New Year's in the jungle back in '68. But Sarah cut me off mid-sentence with those sharp words that still echo in my head. I sat there in that leather chair she'd positioned me in, like some decoration she had to tolerate. The room went quiet for a moment, and I could feel every eye on me. My grandson Tommy looked embarrassed, staring at his phone. The other guests, Sarah's colleagues and friends, they just turned away, pretending they hadn't heard their hostess humiliate her own father. I clutched my old photo of me and my unit, the one I always carry in my wallet, and felt something break inside my chest. The worst part wasn't the silence that followed. It was the way everyone pretended it hadn't happened. These people in their designer clothes and expensive watches, they just smoothly shifted the conversation to stock portfolios and vacation plans to the Bahamas. Like my pain was a minor inconvenience at their sophisticated gathering. I watched my daughter transform back into the perfect hostess, refilling glasses and laughing at jokes that weren't even funny. If you've ever been silenced by someone who should lift you up, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who used to hang on your every word, then pull up a chair. Because this story starts bitter, but it ends with something sweeter than revenge. And if you enjoy these tales of dignity found in dark places, go ahead and subscribe to Marcus's Memories. I've got plenty more where this came from. The party continued around me like I wasn't even there. Sarah clinked her glass against her boyfriend's, some slick corporate type who'd never worked a day with his hands, laughing too loud at his jokes about market trends and quarterly projections. The countdown began, 10, 9, 8, and I realized I was counting down to more than just a new year. I was counting down to the end of trying to be heard in a house that had no room for my voice. When midnight struck and everyone cheered, I whispered a promise to myself. If my stories weren't welcome at her table, maybe they'd find a home somewhere else. I had survived war, poverty, and loss. I could survive being forgotten by my own blood. The confetti fell around me like snow, and I felt something shift inside. Not anger, but determination. But sometimes the most powerful weapon an old man has isn't anger. It's patience and a good memory. I stood up slowly, straightened my old suit jacket, and walked toward the door. Behind me, the party raged on without missing a beat, proving exactly how little my presence had mattered to begin with. There was a time when Sarah would beg me to tell those same stories she now calls embarrassing. I remember her as a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, curled up next to me on our old couch in the house her mama and I bought with my GI Bill money. She traced the scar on my forearm with her tiny finger, while I told her about the friends I made overseas, the courage I saw in the darkest moments. "Tell me about Sergeant Johnson again, Daddy," she'd whisper, and I'd paint pictures with my words about how we looked out for each other when the world seemed determined to tear us apart. Back then, my stories were treasures to her. She'd ask her teachers if she could write about her hero daddy for school projects. Those were the golden years, when my little girl saw me as larger than life. I remember one particular evening when she was 9, sitting on the front porch while summer bugs danced around the porch light. She'd made me a paper medal from construction paper and gold glitter, pinning it to my chest with all the seriousness of a military ceremony. "This is for being the bravest daddy in the world," she announced. And I felt prouder in that moment than when I received my actual Bronze Star. I worked double shifts at the steel mill to give her everything I never had. Ballet lessons, piano classes, trips to the museum, anything to expand her world beyond the neighborhood where bullets sometimes sang lullabies at night. Her mama, God rest her soul, would pack us lunches for Saturday adventures downtown, and Sarah would hold my hand tight, proud to walk beside her old man. Those Saturday trips were sacred to us. We'd ride the MARTA train into the city, and Sarah would press her face to the window asking questions about everything we passed. When we'd visit the Civil Rights Museum, she'd stand mesmerized by the exhibits, then turn to me with wide eyes. "Daddy, were you there when all this happened?" I'd nod, and she'd squeeze my hand tighter, like she was holding on to history itself. The first crack appeared when she got accepted to Emory University. Suddenly, my grammar wasn't refined enough, my stories too rough around the edges for her new friends. She'd changed the subject when I mentioned my time in service. like my sacrifice was something to be ashamed of instead of honored. After she graduated and started climbing that corporate ladder, the visits became shorter. The phone calls grew stiff and formal. When her mama passed 3 years ago, I thought grief might bring us closer together. Instead, it seemed to build a wall between us brick by brick. At the funeral, Sarah gave a beautiful eulogy about her mother's strength and grace. But she never mentioned how I held that woman's hand through chemo treatments, or how I learned to cook her favorite meals when she was too weak to stand. It was like I had become invisible even in my own story. I sat in that front pew, wearing my best suit, feeling like a stranger at my own wife's farewell. Still, I kept hoping that somewhere inside the polished executive lived that little girl who once thought her daddy hung the moon. The one who made me construction paper medals and believed my stories could change the world. The signs were there long before that New Year's humiliation, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to heartbreak. It started with the little corrections, the way Sarah would wince when I said "ain't" in front of her friends, or how she'd quickly change my stories when she retold them, polishing out what she called my colorful language. Last Thanksgiving, I brought up my buddy Jerome's grandson who'd just enlisted in the Marines. I was sharing how proud we old soldiers were, how military service built character and taught you what really mattered in life. Sarah rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might fall out. "Dad, not everyone needs to solve their problems by joining the army," she said, cutting her turkey with surgical precision. The comment hit me like a slap. I'd never pushed military service on anyone, just shared my gratitude for what it had given me. Discipline, brotherhood, purpose. But in Sarah's mind, apparently, I was some old fool trying to recruit everyone into my outdated way of thinking. I watched her slice that turkey and wondered when my life experiences had become so worthless to her. The worst part wasn't her words, it was Tommy's reaction. My 16-year-old grandson just nodded along, like his grandpa's service was some outdated relic from a history book. I tried to explain how the military had saved me, given me purpose and brothers for life. But Sarah's dismissive sighs filled the room louder than my voice. I started paying closer attention after that, noticing every little way she diminished me. When I'd mention working at the steel mill, she'd quickly add, "Before Dad retired, of course." Like my 35 years of honest labor were something embarrassing that needed explanation. When I talked about the neighborhood I grew up in, she'd redirect. But of course, things are so different now. Christmas morning was another knife twist. I brought over a framed photo of me receiving my Bronze Star, thinking maybe Tommy would want it for his room, a piece of family history he could be proud of. Sarah intercepted it before it reached his hands. "Dad, his room has a very specific aesthetic. This doesn't really fit." The photo ended up in a closet buried under winter coats like a shameful secret. I started noticing how she'd steer conversations away whenever I began speaking. If I mentioned my childhood in rural Georgia, she'd suddenly remember urgent emails that couldn't wait. If I talked about the lessons I'd learned from hard times, she'd check her phone or refill everyone's drinks, anything to avoid listening. The most painful moment came in October when Tommy was struggling with a history project about civil rights. I offered to share my first-hand experiences, the marches I'd joined after coming home from Vietnam, the discrimination I'd faced even after serving my country with honor. Sarah cut in smoothly. "That's okay, Dad. We'll just use online sources. They're more comprehensive. More comprehensive than living through it, apparently. More reliable than a man who'd walked those marches, who'd faced those struggles, who'd earned his place in that history through sweat and sacrifice." I sat there wondering when I'd become less trustworthy than Wikipedia in my own granddaughter's education. New Year's Eve arrived like a storm I should have seen coming. Sarah's downtown loft was decorated in black and gold, filled with her marketing agency colleagues and their perfectly pressed smiles. The space screamed money, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, furniture that probably cost more than my first car, abstract art that looked like someone had thrown paint at a canvas and called it genius. I felt out of place from the moment I walked in, like a wrinkled dollar bill in a wallet full of crisp hundreds. The other guests wore clothes with designer labels I couldn't pronounce, talked about wine vintages and European vacations like they were discussing the weather. I stood there in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my wife's funeral, feeling ancient and irrelevant. She'd positioned me in a corner chair, what she probably thought was the seat of honor, but felt more like a penalty box. From there, I could watch her work the room, champagne glass in hand, every inch the successful executive. When someone asked about her family, she pointed vaguely in my direction. "Oh, that's my father." No stories, no pride, just acknowledgement of my existence like I was a piece of furniture that came with the apartment. I nursed my ginger ale. Sarah had forgotten I didn't drink alcohol anymore, hadn't for 20 years, and watched these people discuss things I knew nothing about. Cryptocurrency, startup investments, social media strategies. I might as well have been listening to a foreign language. Every now and then someone would glance my way with polite curiosity, but Sarah never bothered to include me in any conversation. Around 11:30, a conversation about sacrifice and patriotism started up near my chair. These young folks were debating whether military service still mattered in the modern world, whether veterans deserved special recognition, whether war stories had any relevance in today's society. I saw my opening, finally a chance to contribute something meaningful to the evening. I started sharing about New Year's Eve 1968, how we celebrated in a makeshift bunker outside Da Nang, how we promised each other we'd make it home to see another year. I talked about the boy from Alabama who shared his last cigarette with me, about the chaplain who led us in prayer while mortars fell around us. The group gathered closer, actually interested in what this old man had to say. For a moment I felt alive again, relevant like my experiences mattered. That's when Sarah's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Dad, please. Nobody wants to hear that story anymore. It's New Year's Eve. Let's focus on the future, not the past." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the pity in people's eyes, the uncomfortable shuffling of feet. My own daughter had just told me, and everyone in that room, that my experiences, my life, didn't matter. That the sacrifices I'd made for country and family were boring dinner table scraps, embarrassing reminders of an irrelevant past. I set down my ginger ale and stood up slowly, my knees protesting after 68 years of carrying me through life. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the humiliated old man would do next. "You're right, sweetheart," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fire burning in my chest. "Maybe it is time to focus on the future." I kissed her forehead. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either, and walked out into the Atlanta night. The countdown to midnight echoed behind me as I walked to my car, but I was already counting down to something else entirely. The fireworks exploded overhead as I drove home, but they felt like a celebration of my liberation rather than just another new year. I went home to my little house in Decatur and sat in the silence for 3 days. The walls seemed to echo with all the stories nobody wanted to hear anymore. My wife's sewing chair sat empty in the corner, and I could almost hear her voice. "Marcus, you've got more stories than anyone should keep locked up inside." The house felt different somehow, like Sarah's words had poisoned the air. I walked from room to room looking at all the photos she'd never bothered to ask about. Me and my unit in Vietnam, my wedding day, Sarah's first steps, family barbecues where we all laughed together. When had all these memories become burdens instead of treasures? I spent those first days just sitting, feeling sorry for myself if I'm being honest. Jerome called twice, but I let the answering machine pick up. I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, wasn't ready to hear someone else confirm what I already knew, that my own child had rejected everything I was. On January 4th, I pulled out the old typewriter she'd bought me for my retirement, said I should write my memoir someday. I'd laughed at the time, told her who'd want to read about an old soldier's life. But sitting there in that quiet house with Sarah's words still stinging, I realized maybe she'd been right all along. The machine sat on my kitchen table like a challenge. I'd never written anything longer than a grocery list, never thought I had the education or the talent to put together a real book. But something about those silent keys called to me. If my stories didn't deserve to be heard out loud, maybe they deserved to be preserved on paper. I started with that New Year's Eve in Vietnam, the story my daughter didn't want to hear. My fingers found the keys slowly at first, hunt and pecking like I was learning a new language. But as the words flowed, something inside me came alive. I wrote about the fear and courage, the brotherhood forged in impossible circumstances, the way we held on to hope when everything else was falling apart. Day after day, I sat at that kitchen table and poured my life onto paper. Stories about growing up poor in rural Georgia, about facing racism even after serving my country, about meeting the love of my life at a church social. I wrote about raising Sarah, about the pride I felt watching her graduate, about the slow heartbreak of becoming a stranger to my own child. My buddy Jerome would stop by every few days, finding me hunched over those pages like a man possessed. "Marcus, you're gonna wear out those keys," he'd joke, but I could see the admiration in his eyes. He'd been there for most of these stories. Some of them were his stories too. Sometimes he'd sit at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and sharing details I'd forgotten, helping me get the memories just right. Months passed like this, me and my typewriter having conversations with the past. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't bitter about being silenced. I was doing something bigger than seeking revenge. I was preserving truth. I was making sure these stories existed somewhere, even if my own family didn't want to hear them. Every click of those keys felt like an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against being forgotten. By October, I had 300 pages of memories, typed single space on that old machine. I stared at the stack of paper, thick as a phone book, and realized I'd done something I never thought possible. I'd written a book. Not just scattered memories, but a real, honest-to-goodness book with chapters and themes and a story that mattered. I almost threw those pages away twice. Who was I kidding, thinking anyone would want to read an old soldier's rambling memories? The stack of typewritten pages sat on my kitchen table for weeks, gathering dust while I wrestled with doubt. Every time I looked at them, I heard Sarah's voice. Nobody wants to hear that story anymore. But Jerome wouldn't let me give up. He'd seen me working on those pages for months, watched me pour my heart onto paper. "Marcus, you've lived through history," he kept saying. "These young folks need to hear this. They need to understand what came before them." Finally, he convinced me to at least try. He had a neighbor whose daughter worked in publishing in New York, some fancy firm that handled real authors, not old men with typewriters. Margaret Chen took my manuscript as a favor to Jerome, promising nothing more than a quick read. I wrapped those pages in brown paper like a precious gift and sent them off, expecting nothing but disappointment in return. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. I was making my usual breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, when that New York number appeared on my caller ID. "Mr. Washington, I stayed up all night reading your book." Margaret's voice crackled through my old landline. Her words came fast, excited, like she'd had too much coffee. "This isn't just a memoir, it's a masterpiece. You've captured something essential about the American experience, about dignity in the face of dismissal." I nearly dropped the phone. This educated woman from New York, this professional who dealt with real writers every day, was telling me that my stories mattered, that the memories Sarah had rejected were worth preserving. Margaret talked about things I'd never heard of: narrative arc, authentic voice, commercial appeal. But what I understood was the excitement in her voice, the genuine amazement. The next months felt like a whirlwind dream. Margaret became my editor, polishing my rough words while keeping my voice intact. She explained things like advance payments and book tours, concepts as foreign to me as speaking Mandarin. When she mentioned the advance amount, more money than I'd made in my last 5 years at the steel mill, I nearly dropped the phone. Margaret helped me understand that what I'd written wasn't just my story. It was the story of countless men and women who'd served their country, raised their families, and watched the world change around them. "You're speaking for a generation, Mr. Washington," she told me during one of our phone calls. "People who feel forgotten, dismissed, left behind." Voices from the Margins, A Soldier's Truth hit bookstores the following spring. The title was Margaret's idea, though she insisted the words came from my manuscript. The first week it sold modestly, a few hundred copies to people who probably bought it by accident. Then something magical happened. Readers started talking. Book clubs picked it up. Veterans organizations recommended it. Social media, which I barely understood, buzzed with quotes from my stories. People were sharing passages about resilience, about finding dignity in difficult circumstances, about the bonds that hold families and communities together. By month 2, it was climbing bestseller lists faster than Margaret had ever seen. By month 3, I was getting interview requests from major news shows, CNN, NPR, even that morning show my wife used to watch. Margaret explained that my book had touched something deep in American culture, the hunger for authentic stories, for wisdom earned through real struggle. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had said nobody wanted to hear these stories anymore. Turns out the whole country was hungry for them. The book hit #1 on the bestseller list on a Tuesday morning in June. Margaret called to congratulate me, but I was already getting a different kind of call, one I'd been expecting but dreading. My phone had been ringing all morning with interview requests, but when I saw Sarah's name on the caller ID, my heart skipped a beat. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was different than I'd heard in years, uncertain and small. "I saw the news about your book. I didn't know you were writing." I sat in my kitchen chair, the same one where I'd typed every word of those stories she didn't want to hear. The morning light streamed through the window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny celebrations. "Well, honey, you made it clear my stories weren't welcome at your table. So, I found them another home." The silence stretched between us like a gulf, filled with months of hurt and misunderstanding. I could hear her breathing, could almost see her struggling with words she'd probably never thought she'd have to say. When she spoke again, her voice cracked like she was 7 years old again. "Dad, I made a mistake. I was so focused on impressing people that I forgot. I forgot you raised me to be proud of where I came from." That Tuesday became a turning point in more ways than one. The Today Show wanted me for their Friday morning segment. NPR scheduled an hour-long interview. Barnes & Noble was planning book signings in 12 cities. But none of that mattered as much as the conversation I was having with my daughter. The first real one we'd had in years. 3 days later, she showed up at my door with tears in her eyes and a copy of my book in her hands. She'd read it cover to cover, she said, sitting in her car outside my house for an hour before finding the courage to knock. "I remembered things I'd forgotten," she whispered, holding the book like it was fragile. "Like how you used to make me pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse when I was sad. Like how you never missed a single piano recital, even when you were working double shifts. We talked for hours, really talked, for the first time in years." She apologized for the New Year's Eve humiliation, for making me feel small and worthless. "I was so busy trying to be someone I thought I should be," she said, "that I forgot to honor the man who made me possible." We cried together on my front porch, surrounded by the photos and memories she'd once been ashamed of. The book tour was everything Margaret promised and more. Cities across America, audiences hanging on every word I'd once been told to stop sharing. Young veterans approached me after readings, thanking me for telling their story too. Students wrote essays about lessons they'd learned from my experiences. Teachers assigned my book in history classes, using my memories to help kids understand what their grandparents had lived through. The sweetest moment came when Tommy called to say he was using my book for his senior project on American heroes. "Grandpa, I want to interview you about your life. I'm proud to tell your stories." His voice was strong, confident, nothing like the embarrassed teenager who'd avoided my gaze at that Thanksgiving table. Sarah started bringing friends to my readings, introducing me as my father, the best-selling author. But more importantly, she started asking me to tell those old stories again, listening like that little girl who used to trace the scar on my arm. She kept a copy of my book on her coffee table, and when visitors asked about it, she'd beam with pride. "That's my dad's story. He's quite a writer." The financial success was nice. I could finally fix the roof, maybe take a real vacation. But the real victory was watching my family remember who I was. We create families to love us, but sometimes they forget how. Sometimes you have to remind the world, and your own blood, that your voice matters. Tell me, have you ever been silenced by someone who should have been listening? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? If this story touched your heart, leave me a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to Marcus's Memories. I've got a lifetime of stories still waiting to be told. The best revenge isn't anger, it's proving them wrong with grace. Sometimes the stories people don't want to hear are exactly the ones the world needs most.